Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I'm going to be going over warping in Ableton Live. Warping is an essential core feature of Ableton Live, and it is essential to know. And it's also one of those confusing things that beginners have a lot of trouble with. What warping is it is time stretching of audio, and what happens to that audio when you time stretch it. So let's dive in. I'm going to give you 3 pieces of audio that you tend to work with within Ableton Live. This is one-shots, loops, and tracks. Let's get a one-shot. That's not a one-shot. Let's go percussion. Yeah, that's good. So this is a one-shot. It is just a single sound. Right, and it's something that you drag into there. You can drag it into a sampler. One shots, it's just a single sample, and in this case, it is a percussion-y thing. Right, there's no BPM tied to it. It's independent of tempo, so keep that in mind when you're looking at one shots. Loops here. Loops are tied to tempo. Trying to find a good one. Okay, that's good. So this is a loop. This loop is tied to tempo. It is 140 BPM, and it sounds like so. Right? Why is it different? Well, because it's automatically warped, and it is warped to 140 BPM. I'm going to be going over this a couple times. It is, it's basically saying that this clip, the length of it is, 1 bar, I guess, and it is 140 BPM. And Ableton Live is very smart. It can read the title and it can guess. And why does it sound slow? Because the tempo that we have in Ableton Live is 117, and then this loop is playing at 100. This loop is 140 BPM, kind of raw. And we right-click and then select, or we right-click and then loop. We'll notice that the loop length is 1 bar. 1 bar, 140 BPM, 117. How does that work? Well, it's done with warping. It effectively warped this 140 BPM loop to fit within 117 BPM. Right? Really cool stuff. And what does this do? Well, it gives continuity to all of the audio that you are working with. So if you have like drums at 140, and then you have a vocal at 130, and then some other stuff at other BPMs, and then you're playing your whole project at a tempo of like 110, it won't go out of time. And I'll give you an example of what an unwarped thing does when it goes out of time. It's just this percussion one shot right here. Right? It is not warped, right? We can select each clip, right? This is warped, this is not. And I didn't have to do this, it just automatically set it up. As I increase and decrease the BPM, the one shot gets longer and shorter because it is independent of tempo. That right there. If I were to unwarp this loop here, right, we can see we have our loop region of 1 bar, and I'm increasing and decreasing the tempo here, the BPM in Ableton Live. We can see that it's getting longer and shorter, which doesn't work if I want to change things. Right, doesn't really work. So what I'll do is I'll just go Control Z like that, and yeah, it's warped again. So I undid that. It is warped once again. Hooray! So one shot loop. There's another piece of audio that you'll be working with, and this will be a challenging one. And I say track, and track is a kind of a placeholder for a piece of audio that it's not easily, I guess, warped to fit in any one BPM. And longer tracks don't warp well automatically, especially this one. This one would be a piece of audio with a number of different breaks in it, all the different BPMs and spaced out differently. We'll just give that a play here. right? Doesn't sound right. So this requires to be, this needs to be warped in order to fit in the track here. So we're going to be doing that a little bit down the road. So one shots, loops, tracks. Okay, let's start off with the act of warping. Like, we're going to take little tiny steps right now. So this would be the one shot. It is not warped. So this would be the warping section here, and I will select that there. So this is the warping section. These are like, you know, the kind of main controls of the options when you are warping. So we can just hit warp, and look at that. It will effectively add this yellow thing, and I'll just get rid of that other yellow thing. It'll add this warp marker here. And you'll notice that now, as we move the BPM up and down, that stays the same length because it's kind of committed to what it was originally, and it's warped now. We unselect it, it will kind of go back. We increase and decrease the BPM. The tempo gets longer and shorter, right? But if we hit warp, it will kind of stay the way it is. That's the basic concept of warping, or I guess time stretching. So what do you do now? Well, let's listen to it. Right, so this is a sound that I guess actually I'm gonna demonstrate. So we have this warp marker here. We're gonna do this a number of times, so we kind of get it. We have a warp marker here. So a warp marker indicates a speed change, right? And every piece of audio that you hit warp on will have at least one, right? And this warp marker, when you select it, it has a segment BPM. So I can increase and decrease that, right? And that is the time at which that it will change its BPM to whatever you want to set. You can do it that way. So let's say, you know, if you have a loop, you can, give me an example, right? So you have a loop here. This one, we know it's 140. We select that warp marker, and we can just drag this to 140. We can actually tell it what BPM it is, and it will warp that. So there's an end warp marker and then a beginning warp marker. We'll get into this in a little bit, but let's go back to this percussion-y friend here. We can select and add in more warp markers, which are changes in speed. So let's do that. Let's just go over here and we'll double click, and we've effectively put in a yellow warp marker here, and we can move that around. So we can make the area between this warp marker and this warp marker super short, and then leave the rest of it, it's what it was, right? So you can see that up here even more so. Like, look at that. That's pretty cool. And that is how you essentially move things around. We'll get into this and how to do it in a little bit. This is just introduction. So you can just arbitrarily, I want you to do this, just arbitrarily move these around, and you can listen to what it sounds like, right? So there's this space now, like this initially kind of short percussion sound, right? That onset or that transient is now super long. So it does a cool thing, and how it behaves is dictated by the warp mode, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So we can drag this around, we can add more warp markers, we can squish that part, we can move that around. So look at that. Isn't that awesome? And this is non-destructive, like a lot of things are, and that's essentially what warping is. And these things snap to the grid. We can change that. We can zoom in and out, and all those sorts of fun things. We can just drag that like that. We can select the end, right, like that, and move it around. Just get used to moving these around. It's really cool. Right, so I have a little bit of, sustain on that that ending part, like the decay of that sound. right? And that's all well and good, and that is essentially, yeah, default kind of warping. And you'll notice that it is maintaining pitch, or the timbre. It's trying really hard to maintain that pitch, and that's done with interpolation, which is a topic for another video. So right now I just have a warp marker at the beginning and a warp marker at the end, and I can move it around like so. Alternatively, I can hold Shift and select this part up here. Notice that the cursor changes. I can stretch this within the arrangement view. So I don't need, if I wanted this to be at a particular area here, I can do it without having to do it down here and muck about. I can move it around like that. All right. So right now we are on Beats mode in Ableton Live. This is a warp mode, and there's a number of different warp modes. There are two main types. Ones that maintain pitch, or you can change pitch independent of the stretching of your track. And then there's the other one which acts more as a traditional time stretch. Let's select that right now. Oh, I also want to kind of point out that you have your multiple warp markers here. Each warp marker has its own kind of segment BPM. So we can select this one right here. We selected this warp marker. We can increase the BPM with this slider here if we want to control it, and then select this one and then change this BPM slider. And it might work better if we have that right there. So there you go. Yeah. So this is just another way to dial in your track here. If you have multiple tracks, you can kind of go through at the beginning and say, oh, this is at this tempo, this tempo, this tempo. So there's that right there. So I'm just gonna select that. I have my ending warp marker, like so. So let's change it off Beats right now. So Beats is a particular warp mode. Right click and we'll go repitch. So this is how it would work if it was on a turntable. This is how we expect it to work. Right? It's just like putting it in a sampler and moving it around, going up and down the keyboard. That's effectively what it's doing. And this is stretching pieces. And I'll just make that a little bit longer. Stretching certain pieces, making other pieces shorter. Right, and that's with pitch. So there's no, that's with repitch. So there's no maintaining the pitch. So let's go back to Beats. Does it like you would expect? Let's just have it like that. What if we wanted to maintain the length of the track here and bring the pitch up? We can do that with the transpose. And it sounds weird when we go up, especially when we go down. It's really cool. You can get some really nice effects with that. Okay, let's move on. And yeah, let's just move on to a different one. We'll get into all that, I promise. So we need to talk about what an onset is. So we'll double click on this. This is our loop in question. And what is an onset? An onset is a change in spectral energy in a sound. And what happens is Live will actually detect these. And this is what these pseudo markers are for. Right? They are detecting these changes in sound. Like, look at that. You can see. I'll bring this down here. So it has all of these onsets, or transients. We'll say transients. And this is important to know because in Beats mode of warping, which is what we have been using thus far besides repitch, And I totally went off the rails, and I probably would have confused a lot of people if I published that. I'm going to redo this part where I explain the warp modes, and I'm not going to get into the deep metaphysical, spiritual, time stretching, and all that fun stuff. I'm just going to try not to overwhelm. So, because this is going to be a brand new concept for a lot of people, we'll get into the complex stuff in a bit. So, in a bit, I mean like later on down the road. So I was talking about the beats mode. So the beats mode essentially splits the audio into separate samples. So we would split it up into something like a sample like this, right? Because the preserve is on transient, which is all of these pseudo warp markers, right? So it will preserve these into their own kind of separate sampler, essentially, and it will play each of them in its full kind of regard without doing any, uncool stuff. And you'll notice that this is essentially on a grid. This is on 16ths, and I can prove that by right-clicking and then going 16ths. And look, yeah, it just kind of does that. It's just, this is a very boring loop because it's just on each 16ths. If you had something that was a little bit different, it would, preserve it all the same. These kind of boxes would move. And yeah, what it does is it essentially, it works very well on drums, and it preserves drums. That's why it's called beats mode. Yeah, so each of these would be its own sort of sampler, and it would play it like so. And depending on what the tempo and the speed of what's going on, the kind of, I guess you would call it the transient loop mode. And let's see what it says there. Off. Each segment plays to the end and then stops. So it will just play to the end and then stop. And for this one right here, so this would be the loop off mode. We just play once. This is essentially one shot. Loop forward, it will play and then reset back to the front again. It's kind of like how a granulizer works. And then this one would be the loop back and forth. And I want to demonstrate this. And I did in the last video, and I got deep, like Joey Diaz deep. So let's take a look at this right here. So right now, let's just set this to like a very, very low BPM. And yeah, something like that. Okay, so we can see that effectively, I'll duplicate this. It is, I'll freeze this, and then I will flatten. And then we can see that it's just selecting the one shot, and it's not doing anything else. This is actually kind of pitching it down, you can see. And, this right here is now here. And it didn't really do anything fancy except right there. So what's going on there? There's probably, what's going on right there? Yeah, it's this warp marker right here. So it's kind of preserving that, and it's at a lower volume, so it just kind of preserves that. And that is on beats with transient detection. And if we were to select the 16ths preserve, it does the exact same thing because this is on 16ths. It does the exact same thing. And I transpose it down. Right? Same thing right there. If I were to set it to 32, right? It is effectively restarting it every 30 seconds. So it will play this over and over again, and then it will play the in-between. If I set that to 32, it'll play that. So typically, the beats on transient always sounds good. Depending on what you're doing, it will automatically adjust that, and it will do great things, and that is with the pseudo warping mode. Or the beats warping mode with the pseudo markers. And just like just like before, I'll just set this to repitch. Just like before, we can actually grab these. And this is extremely useful for, I'll get rid of that. This is extremely useful for warping later on down the line when you have something that's not cut to a particular loop length. You can select these and actually move them around. And right now they're snapping to the grid. I can go narrow and zoom in. I can move that guy around like that. So I can add some swing. Right? I'll set this to beats. Right? So what do we have? We have like swing going on. So it's like, that's essentially swing, just moving that over. And all sorts of fun stuff you can do with that. And, you know, with the pitch, yeah, it'll just stretch it and, you know, it will be pitched. It'll repitch like a record. You know, those things that are all over the place. And we double click and it kind of goes back. So that is the basic warping of a loop. There's a number of different warping modes, which all have their different kind of applications depending on what you're doing. And what goes into what you're doing is the original speed of the track, whether you're pitching it up or down, whether it's drums, whether it's vocals, whether it's a full track. What kind of processing and attention do you need when the warping algorithm is not truncating, what's the word? Interpolating between these values, right? So what it's doing, these little dots, right? These little dots are getting moved around. And these little dots, these little samples need to be interpolated. And it requires a bit of math. And it's a lot of math a second just to, you know, get all this going on. And there are certain warping modes that are optimized for different kinds of scenarios. So this drum right here, this would be for drums, so beats would be appropriate. We also have tones. Tones are for kind of tonal. I'm actually going to show you. They're for, yeah, clear and distinct tones. And I'll find one here. Let's go like this. And sounds. Right, something like that. Some a little bit dry. Cool, let's do that. Right, and let's say this is like a vocal or something very complicated, like a vocal, a single vocal. It has a distinct pitch, and it's dictated by, you know, this repeating, somewhat repeating pattern here. And with, we select warp, and then we go to tones. We have the control of what is called the grain size, and the grain size takes into account, I guess, how much of a we're getting into the granulizer kind of granular synthesis sort of thing, and let's look at the help menu here. Larger values help avoid artifacts that can often occur when pitch contour is unclear but can result in audible repetitions. So yeah, this splits it up into separate grains. I did a quick video on granular synthesis with Pigments 2. If you're curious, I'll probably get into it down the line. It's a little bit more advanced, but it splits everything up into separate grains around the playhead and creates somewhat of a swarm, and then crossfades them in together. There's a lot of really wacky stuff that's going on there, but I'll pitch that way down. Right, so higher values, like it said, it's kind of repeating, but lower values makes it sound kind of similar to what it was. Right? And that would be good for, say, vocals and things like that. So there is that. So let's go to, what's the next one? The next one would be texture. And texture is for, I guess, what would it be for? It would be for like weird sounds that aren't, there's a good example. Spectrasonics. Drones, maybe. Right, so these don't have a pitch that we can kind of They're a mishmash of different keys and weird stuff, as opposed to, right, that has a key to it, and that key that note is A. It's an A. So we can tune our samplers to that. But this right here, right, it's a lot of stuff. Fun fact, they made a lot of Silent Hill sounds with this, also a lot of Zelda stuff. Nintendo 64 era onwards. It's a really nice pack. So what does texture do? Well, texture is essentially the Psytrance button, and we have the grains. It's kind of like the granulizer, but what it does is, it's, I'm looking at the help file right now. It's ambiguous pitch contour for polyphonic orchestral music, noise, atmospheric pads, things like that. Grain size determines the grain size used to, but unlike tones mode, this is a setting that Live will use unaltered without considering the signal's characteristics. Fluctuation is the randomness to that grain size, where the start and stop point, and this gives you, I guess, more of a, let's just say it's the Psytrance button. Does some really cool stuff. And then from there, we have two of the most kind of complex, well, that's what they're called. They are the Complex and the Complex Pro. So these are two kind of separate versions of the same algorithm. One is more CPU heavy than the other, and this is for whole songs and complex audio. And this has a lot of math in it, I'm assuming, and I'm not going to be able to pretend to kind of explain what this is doing, but essentially what all of these algorithms are doing, besides the repitch, well, maybe even the repitch, is changing what these sample points, where these kind of fall once they get squished together, right? We're interpolating between two values that are very close, and we're changing that value. So there's a lot of floating point math going on there. I'm not qualified to explain it, but that's essentially what is going on. And the complex warp modes are a complex interpolation of how these sounds, how the audio is, interpolated. And it just has a different sound. Wait. I want this one. Nope. Oh, I selected the wrong one. LOL. I'm gonna go back to this here, and then we're gonna warp something that's a little bit more complicated. I'll show you how to do that. Right. So let's go back to complex. Right. And with extreme values of complex, I mean, you use it for like vocals, like important pieces of audio or whole tracks, where there's a lot of stuff going on. High frequencies, low frequencies, a lot going on there. You get some like weird ghosting stuff. But a lot of the time it is very smooth. And it's a mixture of all the other algorithms put together. It's also CPU intensive, so keep that in mind. Well, it was a couple years ago. Now it's like whatever. There's also the Complex Pro, which has the formats, which is, it's a format preserve. So this is getting into the math, and what it does, essentially, from what I understand, you have the option in the frequency domain to preserve the formats, and the envelope preserves roughly how the spectral characteristics of the material are affected. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm in no way qualified, but it's a very kind of complex way. So the format here is kind of a, let's say that it allows you to set the compromise, preserving the frequency content. But if you're willing to give up a little bit of the frequency content for, more of a smoother warping experience, then you have that choice. And the envelope, as far as I know, 128 is suited well for most audio, lower values when using very high-pitched samples, and higher values when using low-pitched material. So the help section is very useful, and it echoes kind of what I said. It depends on whether you're pitching something up or down, depending on kind of what's going on here. Right, so large envelope value. Right. This can be a deep video, and I'm not qualified to explain it. So let's move on to the super awesome warping experience. So let's get this open here. We have a drum loop here, or not even a loop. I want to turn it into a loop. But we have a sample from a break from a record. Oh, and I am not gonna do that. I want to warp that. I'm going to warp all of these, but I'm going to start with the first one here. I can tell that these are all kind of distinct pieces of audio. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select that, move that over, and then select this, and then move that over. So these are separate pieces of audio. This is how you would sample off of a record or a 12-inch or whatever. Right? Really cool sounds, and believe it or not, these are the basis for a lot of sounds in electronic music, and they're fun to look for. But sample crate digging is a different story for a different day. So we want to warp this, right? And we are going to actually reference these both here. Right, so we have the clip down here, and then the actual clip view here, and the arrangement view up top. Let's hit warp. Kaboom. Okay, so that did something. It just set it into warp mode. It didn't actually do anything. And let's hop to it. The first thing that we need to do is find the beginning beat, right? So everyone beatbox with me right now. Doom, cha, da-dum, dum, cha, right? We know where to start, like intuitively. Like any like doom, cha, doom, right? We can pick out the first part of a loop. We can pick that out. So let's actually find it. Right? It's right there, but let's just select this. Right there. So that's where it is, and we'll actually just look for it up here. And I'm doing this because you need to be able to look at the top part here and the bottom part here and know that they are linked, and we can do things with what's going on here. Right? So right up here. Look at this area right here, and again. Right? So we find that. It's around right there. So what we'll do is we can move that like that. I'll show you other ways to do this as we move on. So we're going to set that, and we'll hit play. Right? Look at that. Then we'll zoom in even more if we really want to get in there. Right? So it wasn't right here, it was around here. Right? So it is not on the grid anymore. We can look at that. I can show it to you, right? It's offset. So what I want to do is I'm just going to select it and move it over, and I'll set it back to narrow grid. So first thing we want to do is we want to look at this, right? So this part's darker gray, this part's a lighter gray, and yeah, this is the play position now. We moved the play position in the clip view, right? I'll show you. Look at that. We're moving it. I'll get Control Z. This is the beginning play position. In the original warp kind of area has it starting over here, and the start position is offset from 2-2. It thinks it's like bar number 2, like beat number 2. What the heck's going on here? So what we want to do is in this play start area right here. Don't worry, you'll get this. I got it, and if I can get it, then you definitely can, because I'm not at all good at life or whatever. So we want to set this to the first beat, because it is the first beat. We need to tell Ableton Live that it is the first beat in the loop. What we'll do is we'll right click on it and we'll go set 1.1.1 here. Click on that, kaboom, it does that. So now, what do we have? So what is the second beat? Boom, da, right? It's this. Excuse me. I know it's this. Well, what can we do now? We can actually double click and drag that over. And we can hit the metronome just to confirm, right? I think I did that a little too fast. We got the metronome here. I want this metronome to be the metronome and the loop that I'm working on, the thing that I'm warping, to be matched. It's not matched, right? I know that this is the second beat here because I can hear it. I can select this area right here where the speaker is, right? So the first part, right? We can hear that. I'm pressing the space bar over and over again for those that don't know what's going on. We've warped our first beat, right? But then something happens. It does that, and that's not very helpful. And what we can do is, actually, I double-click that, and I'll just move that over again. So double-click and then move that there. And then, where's the next one? I'll double-click this probably. Nope, I will double-click this, because this is the beat, and this just comes with just kind of somewhat experience. Right? And then it slows down there. And this can get a little bit tedious, and I'm doing this just to show you the power of warping. So I'm going to actually Control-Z, 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 get rid of that. I'm going to find the next bar. And I'm going to set this to beats. I'm going to turn up the metronome too. Right? So it's doing something. And it's doing something that I didn't anticipate, but I can tell that this would be the end. And I'll show you, because this would be the ba-boom, right? It's this part right here. If we move that over, because the next bar will start here, I can actually move that over. Right? And now it's synchronized just by moving that one thing. Alternatively, another way you can go about warping stuff is, it was like that, right? You can actually select a bar, right? Hit loop, and we can confirm this is 1 bar. This is a 1 bar loop. Reselect our track. Hit that warp marker that we created. Make sure nothing else is going on. And we can change that BPM. And what we can do is we can select that loop, play that loop over and over again, and play around with the BPM until it sounds correct. Right, so it's 92 BPM. Okay, so we have that. Let's move on to this one right here. And I'll do this a tiny bit faster. I'll turn that off. And, right, so we got that. I'll turn that off. Okay, so we have that right there. So let's, before we even warp it, what we can do is we can move the playhead over and look it up there. It moves. Hit that. This is the first beat. And what we can do is we can hit warp. and it'll do that for some reason. And look at this, it already selected the 1-1. I don't need to do that. I don't need to set 1-1 here. It automatically did that. It automatically selects the play start position as 1-1. Sometimes you don't want it at 1-1. You want it to be a little bit before, or you select a different part for 1-1. Right, so what we can do is, we found the beginning, and let's just select the second part here. And another way we can do the moving of the segment BPM is dragging the pseudo marker. So there's two different markers you can interact with. There's the warp marker here, right? And the warp marker, if you remember, it will, between this warp marker and this warp marker, it will change the distance, the pitch between them, or the speed between them, and then leave everything else afterwards. Alternatively, we can select and drag a pseudo marker, and that will kind of select and move the BPM. It's the same as taking this and then moving the BPM. It's just using this as a reference. So what's going on here? Right, let's turn that metronome on. And yeah, we'll go beats. Right, so we're pretty close, right? Let's look at that. So that is on the second, 1.2, that's on the second beat there. But then it goes out of time. Right? And this is where warping, in terms of what we were doing before, comes into play. So that is confirmed to be number 2. And what I can do is I can just drag and kind of repair that, like so. Right? And I can do that sort of thing like that. So what I did is I just wanted to drag that warp marker over, right? So things kind of snap there. And that should be correct. And I'll just move that there, double click, move that there. And now, there you go. I can repitch it. And I can get some jungle going on. And if I'm really confused, I can right click in the session view and just go quarter, select quarter bar, and look at that. Each one has its own kind of section I can look at. So I can reference the top here, which is something that I always tell people to do when they are having trouble warping. Hit that metronome and look at each of these, and things are very well put together. So here's the last one. Right, and yeah, let's actually, we'll go into audio effects, and we will go utility just for fun, and we'll just select the left. We'll go left channel. Oh no, we'll go right channel. Right, so that effectively is just playing this part right here, because there's a very panned loop going on, and I'll show you how to go about doing this in a different way. So we have this here. Right, I want that to be the start point, so I will select that. I will right click and go narrow grid, and yeah, I'll have that. Right, that's the first one. Right, so what I'll do now is I'll just drop it like that, and I will shorten that, and let's hit the metronome, see what's going on. Right, so it's a little bit at a time. What I can do is I can hold shift, and then, oh no, I have to warp it first. Okay, so I warped it and it spazzed out, but yeah, so it's warped now. I can hit shift and just, yeah, move it over and warp it that way. Just to give me a good starting point there, and then I can go in and tidy up that timing and have a grand old time, right? Things like that. And all sorts of fun stuff. And that is essentially warping. For a very large track, you would warp it in between sections of the track. and just keep it on point. And typically I wouldn't have a bunch of warp markers, but yeah, there's that. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. Hope it wasn't too long, and I hope you learned stuff. Take care and have a good one.